Hello, my fellow strawmen, and welcome back to the Fields of Hay. Today I have two more clips from theists who have questions about what atheists like me believe, and I'll do my best to answer them. First up is a video from one Myrie. Take it away, Myrie.
Quick question for you. If you're an atheist, why do you not believe in God?
To put it most simply, I don't believe in God because I've never had a good reason to. God is a supernatural entity, and I've never seen evidence of the supernatural. It's claimed that God can do miracles, but I've never witnessed one. I've never heard a philosophical argument for God's existence that didn't make bad assumptions nor be riddled with logical fallacies. And of the personal testimonies I've heard, they are wildly inconsistent with each other and generally unconvincing that one truth stands above many false religions. As far as I can tell, they're all false.
And if you don't believe in God because you say the book is written by man, why do you believe in evolution? Because that was also made up by a guy.
So first, that isn't my reason. Literally every idea I've ever conceived was ultimately made up by some guy, either myself or someone I listened to or watched. Knowing that the Bible or other scriptures was written by a person doesn't really say whether or not it was inspired by God. The lack of evidence backing up the claims is a much better reason not to believe in God. But there was still a legitimate question in there, which is why I do believe in evolution. I'll give my top two reasons. First is the nested genetic relations between living organisms. If you take a whole bunch of DNA samples from all the various creatures on Earth, and you pair two of them up and compare them, then pair up another two and compare, and you repeat this for all the different pairs of organisms, you'll find that they fall into a very particular pattern. They fall into groups within groups within groups, where all the individuals within a group have more similar DNA with each other than any of them have with individuals outside the group. If all the different organisms were created separately, then they shouldn't fall into this pattern. Nor should all the groups fall under a single ultimate group, which is exactly what happens in reality. All living organisms today use the same codon triplets to translate RNA into polypeptides, which is exactly what one would expect under common ancestry. Under common design, there'd be no requirement for God to do this. He could have given each lineage its own DNA language, so if he does exist, then evidently he had some reason to reuse the same code for each kind. I think that at a minimum, anyone who looks into this evidence and is honest with himself should either believe in evolution or in a God who intentionally deceives people to believe in evolution. And even though that reason stands entirely on its own merit, evolution has so much evidence in its favor that I'll give a second, which is that the geographic distribution of organisms lines up cleanly with the geology of the planet. For example, geologists can show that New Guinea is attached to the Australian plate, while Indonesia is part of the Southeast Asian plate. The Australian plate has been slowly moving towards the Asian one for a few tens of millions of years. Even hundreds of millions of years ago, when Australia was part of Gondwana, it was separated from what would become Asia. Given this, and if evolution is true, then we should see entirely different lineages living in each region, and we do. The lizards of Borneo were more closely related to lizards in Java, Sumatra, and Asia than any of them are to those in Australia and New Guinea. The same goes for the trees, the coral reefs, the spiders, and in fact for entire ecosystems. You only ever find marsupials in Australia, New Guinea, and South America, which used to be part of Gondwana. South America also recently connected to North America, allowing a single species of opossum to take up residence on the continent. But you never find marsupials in Asia or Indonesia, which lines up perfectly with how separated the two continents have been. If God designed everything, then couldn't he have made the exact same climates and land distribution, populated the land with the same creatures, but attached New Guinea to the Asian continent? Couldn't God have made it so the geology didn't line up with the biology? If not, what prevented him? And if he could, then why didn't he? I think that once again, you either accept that God doesn't exist and evolution is true, or that God does exist and is trying to deceive us into thinking evolution is true. But anyway, the fact that some guy first came up with the idea has nothing to do with its merit.
An atheist will say the God of the Bible is evil, but then they'll say morality is subjective.
Yeah, so if I say that God is evil, I say that from my own subjective point of view. I'm not making a claim that God is objectively evil, because I literally never mean that when I use the terms good and evil. I just mean that according to the moral standards that I personally and subjectively hold, mainly humanism, then the raping and enslaving that the God of the Bible condoned and commanded were evil acts, and therefore I find the character of God to be evil.
Religion spews lies, and it's wrong, but then they'll say morality is subjective and truth is relative.
I wouldn't even make the claim that all religions are liars. I think the vast majority of them are people who are honestly searching for the truth, but they make errors of judgment and end up believing things that don't align with reality. Sometimes this is harmless, and other times it leads to extremists taking actions that I subjectively find unforgivably horrible. And while I do agree that morality is subjective, I do not think that all truth is relative. Some truths are relative, mainly those about subjective opinions. It's possible that one person finds blue to be the best color, while another prefers green. Opinions are subjective truths, but there are objective truths too. There are facts about reality which are true for all observers, and presumably still true even without observers to describe or even be aware of the truth. So, hypothetically, if it is objectively true that the universe exists absent a God, then religions are, with a few exceptions, wrong. And that isn't to say that the beliefs are harmful or that believers are intentionally lying, only that their beliefs are not accurate to reality. And it goes both ways. If God really does exist, then I am wrong to believe otherwise. Surely one of us is wrong, and that is an objective truth.
Atheists make no claims, but then they'll say God does not exist.
Most atheists are agnostic, which is the variety that simply lacks belief in God. They do not make any sort of claim about God's existence. The only kind of atheist that has a claim and a corresponding burden of proof are the Gnostic atheists. We say that God does not exist, and personally I use the argument device to support that claim. You may disagree with it, but it's a reason that I find genuinely convincing to me that God could not exist.
Evolution is a fact, but then they'll say there are no absolutes. Evolution is true, but then they'll say truth is relative.
So again, there are absolutes. There isn't absolute morality or absolute purpose, but there are absolutes like the existence of the house my mom grew up in. It's gone now, long demolished, but it existed. That really isn't up for debate to me because I've been to the house and I've seen pictures of her there as a child. I visited my grandma while she still lived there. So with the right evidence, we can establish absolute facts. Evolution is one of those establishable facts, using the two pieces of evidence I gave earlier as well as the literal thousands of smaller supporting evidences. If evidence is presented for God, then we can move him into the absolute truth category, but until then, we can't say for sure that he exists.
We don't claim to know how the universe came to be, but then they'll say the universe came from nothing, or another universe.
I say that the universe has always existed. I think that if there were a version of nothing that could cause a universe, then having that very property would make it a something, not a nothing. So I think that space-time and energy have always existed in some fashion, and that the Big Bang was a transition from some primordial state to one with matter spread throughout that could go on to collapse into galaxies and stars, and eventually a tiny speck of which would become us.
Atheism is a lack of belief in God or God, which is my favorite one out of all of them. First, doesn't require a creator. God is not real.
What's the contradiction here? If someone looks out at the world and doesn't see a requirement for a creator, then they have no reason to believe in a God. But a lack of evidence is not necessarily evidence that there is no God, and so what else should one do except lack belief in God while continuing to search for an answer? And just so we're clear, I didn't leap to my conclusion that God doesn't exist just because I find a lack of evidence for God. The evidence I find is in the form of our own complexity of mind. Our intelligence is so complex that it cannot exist uncaused. Evolution and design are competing explanations for that cause. But then if God is even more knowledgeable and more intelligent than us, then his divine mind must be infinitely more unlikely than our own, and like our own mind could not exist uncaused. But if we propose the same two explanations, evolution can't explain God, and a higher God just keeps kicking the can down the road. So I'll just go with the simplest explanation and say that God doesn't exist. Go watch my ice video if you want a more detailed take.
We don't believe in imaginary things.
I didn't cut her off. She just forgot to finish reading the line, so I'll do it. She finds this statement from atheists to contradict the notion that abiogenesis, universal ancestry, and atheism are real. But that contradiction is dependent on the falsity of those three things. But I've given my reason to believe atheism is true, and the single DNA language I mentioned earlier supports common ancestry. We don't have direct evidence for abiogenesis, but it at least seems plausible to me given that RNA can self-replicate and catalyze functions, and life developing on a planet near a star is in line with thermodynamics. God and the supernatural just don't have the same evidence that they even plausibly exist.
And my favorite, the whole reason I did that original video just to show you the hypocrisy of atheists. Bigotry and discrimination is wrong. Yet they mock and ridicule Christians. And you can go to that video and see it.
I don't speak for all atheists. Certainly there are some out there who spend time railing at the religious when they should spend more time being introspective. But they don't speak for me, and they aren't representative of atheism. I don't condone that kind of behavior, and I try to steer clear of it in my videos. Please correct me if you think I'm wrong, but I don't think I've mocked and ridiculed Myrie in my response today. And while I don't condone those comments that were mocking criticisms rather than constructive ones, I can understand why they're there. Rather than presenting evidence for God's existence, Myrie asked atheists why they don't believe, as though lacking belief isn't the default state. And when she asked why we do believe in evolution, she set up a straw man that it's just because some guy said so and we're all following Darwin no matter what. I'm willing to engage and take those questions seriously, but they're still bad questions, so it's no wonder that so many people don't give them the respect she wants. The internet is full of people, both theists and atheists, who are poor representatives of their side, and posting content about deeply held beliefs is begging for these kinds of people to come along and mock you, especially when you don't ask questions that sound honest. You need to have thick skin to make this kind of content. Christians somehow manage to make having thin skin work because they have their persecution complex and they see denials of their belief as discrimination. But really, it's just them saying things they can't back up and then being offended when people don't take them seriously. Our next clips come courtesy of the channel Second Man Adam. Now, Christians have this habit of being okay with other Christians using their content without credit, something about it all going towards spreading the gospel. So anyway, I have no clue what either of their names are, so I'll call the top guy Adam 1 and the bottom guy Adam 2. It seems on brand.
Say you don't believe in God, yet scientist Sir Roger Penrose calculated the likelihood of the universe having this precise of a design, and the calculation he came up with was 10 billion to the 123rd power, which is the number 10 billion with 123 zeros at the end.
Okay, so first a little math lesson. 10 to the 10 to the 123 is the number that Penrose calculated. This is a power tower, which you read from the top down. It's the same as 10 to a power of a 1 followed by 123 zeros. In the end, you get a 1 followed by more than a Google zeros. Just to write the number, it would take more digits of 0 than there are atoms in the universe. Adam 1 doesn't come close to appreciating the scale of this number, which should absolutely blow my Skittles calculation from 2 videos ago out of the water. Now, to be fair, he made a fairly common and understandable error. He worked from the bottom up, which would give him 10 billion to the 123. But here he should have multiplied his exponents and gotten 10 to the 1230, much closer to my Skittles number than the correct Penrose calculation. But he couldn't even get this right. He tacked on the zeros to the 10 billion, which is like adding the exponent. He effectively got 10 to the 133, which is much smaller than my Skittles calculation and practically nothing compared to the number that he's trying to give. And second, the Penrose number has to do with the entropy content of the early universe. If the primordial arrangement of the particles in the universe was based on chance, then it would support a fine-tuning argument, and a very strong one at that. But I don't think that random chance was behind the primordial state. I think that mathematical symmetry would suggest that the minimal entropy state would be the only one which could primordially exist, in some infinite past. Without the assumption that the universe began by random chance, Penrose's number makes no fine-tuning argument.
You say you don't believe in God, yet atheist scientist Stephen Hawking stated in his book, The Brief History of Time, that at the moment of the Big Bang, the expansion rate of the universe was different by even 1/100,000th millionth of a percent, that the universe would have collapsed back on itself.
It's true. And what is the probability that the expansion rate could have differed by at least that amount? Percent change and percent probability simply aren't the same thing. So sure, maybe there is some precise range it needs to fall in. What is the probability that it falls in that range? If you can't answer that question, then you don't have a fine-tuning argument.
You say you don't believe in God, yet your existence alone as a human was a 400 trillion to 1 odd.
I'm not quite sure what he's getting at here. If I were to calculate the odds that, given abiogenesis, I would come out exactly as I did, I would think they'd be significantly worse than 100 trillion to 1. It too would be the kind of number that makes my Skittles calculation look tiny, but there's a reason this one isn't miraculous to me. Being amazed at the odds of my existence would be the same as being amazed at getting some particular hand of cards in a poker game, and forgetting that you had to get some hand or another. In the same way, evolution would have led to some creature, and I'm just the lucky bloke it happened to be.
You say you don't believe in God, yet did you know if one person's DNA was unraveled and placed end to end, it would stretch to Pluto and back?
I faintly remembered some stat like this, so I looked up the numbers, and actually the DNA would stretch to Pluto and back about 6 times over. It's so weird that he keeps underappreciating the numbers. But at the end of the day, who cares how far it goes? There's a desk sitting in front of me, and if you line up its atoms end to end, they could stretch to Alpha Centauri and back 10 times. So what? If this is just to point out how many billions of nucleotides are in a genome, yeah, it's a lot. But the entropy decrease associated with such transforming is more than accounted for by the energy from the sun over billions of years. Reason to Doubt has a great video going in depth on that calculation, which I'll link here.
You say it takes too much faith to believe in God, and to that I'll ask you, have you ever seen non-intellectual produce intellectual? Have you ever seen non-life produce life?
Lack of evidence is not evidence of lack. That goes both ways. Me asking, have you ever seen God, doesn't prove God's non-existence. And Adam 1 asking, have I ever seen non-intellect produce intellect, doesn't prove that it can't.
Have you ever seen a massive explosion or expansion produce design and order? Every explosion I've ever seen has led to mass destruction, not design and order.
So the Big Bang was certainly an expansion, not an explosion. But either way, I'm not claiming that the order came from the expansion. It just spread material through the universe. It took time, gravitational clumping, and complex chemistry to produce the order in life that we see today.
Right. You say you can't trust biblical texts because they are ancient manuscripts that were written by men thousands of years ago, yet the Bible is the most preserved text in all of humanity, with over 25,000 manuscripts in the world.
I try not to prejudice the Bible in particular. It's all testimonial claims of the supernatural that I have a problem with. Even if the supernatural exists, how am I supposed to tell the difference between true claims and people just making stuff up or imagining things? When it happened isn't particularly important, and the number of manuscripts which agree with each other just means that they all stem from the same source. How does any of that support the veracity of the supernatural claims?
I then ask you, why do you trust the reliability of people like Caesar, Galileo, and many other ancient figures when they have far more less items written about them?
Because those claims aren't supernatural. The existence of a person who did normal human things like performing science or engaging in major world events just isn't supernatural. These are people whose existence and actions are entirely plausible to happen, so I trust the experts and believe that they did. Similarly, I believe that there were real people who the stories of Jesus and David and all the rest were based on, but they were mythologized over time. I don't believe the miracle claims of the Bible for the same reason that Christians don't believe the claims of old Roman cults that Caesar was divine, even though we both agree Caesar existed.
You say that the Bible has been mistranslated and altered, yet the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in the 1950s have proven that claim to be false.
That's true.
I don't think I'm a historical or biblical expert, and so I'll tend to grant the contents of the Bible. I can grant that the Dead Sea Scrolls can prove the Bible's fidelity, but I remain unconvinced for other reasons.
You say you don't believe in the miracles of Jesus, yet you believe in the miracles of the universe being almost perfect in every aspect for us and our ecosystem to survive.
There is no cosmic fine-tuning which convinces me, because we do not know the probabilities that the physical constants of our universe could have been otherwise. There is no terrestrial fine-tuning, because even though there are requirements for planets to have life, the sheer number of planets in the universe would account for our existence. Even if only 1 in a million planets is capable of supporting life, then we'd expect many galaxies to host at least one life-bearing planet. There is no ecosystem-level fine-tuning, because within those life-permitting parameters, life can adapt to the exact conditions of its environment as per the famous puddle analogy of Douglas Adams. And at the cellular level, the fine-tuning of the DNA can be explained by evolutionary forces gradually improving the code over time. At no level is it clear that a designer must have had a hand.
You say it takes too much faith to believe in religion, yet I counter that claim with the notion that I believe it takes way more faith to be an atheist than a theist.
Me too.
So we agree then that faith is a bad thing, right? I think Adam 1 is saying that we want as little faith as possible and as much evidence as possible, and he thinks that atheism requires too much faith. Yet, strangely, he openly admits to use faith, while I am willing to explain every single belief I have with evidence, eventually tracing back to the brute fact that I experience reality. And if you deny this brute fact, which you should evaluate from your own perspective, then you are denying the evidence presented by your own self-awareness. As I build up my other beliefs from this brute fact, at worst I've misunderstood something, but I'm certainly not using faith.
You say you don't need God to have good morals and you would be correct, but then you cannot ground your morality in anything else but pure opinion. And you say, who cares? And then I'd ask you, who was right morally? Because it all comes down to subjective opinion if you're an atheist. And if you've had enough bad people have a bad subjective opinion, we would be in a world of trouble.
I don't know if Adam realizes it, but there is quite a lot of trouble in this world, much of it man-made. The fact that we can't seem to agree on any objective moralities might be a sign that morality isn't objective. But the premise behind his question is actually incredibly important. There are plenty of times when bad people have been handed the reins of power and chaos ensued. There are countless examples scattered throughout human history of avoidable tragedies caused by one person abusing another. They should, to the greatest degree possible, be stopped. I don't think there are many who would argue against that, despite it being easier said than done. But because I think that moralities are limited by our subjectivity, the best way to avoid the bad biases many of us have as individuals is to try to have open discussions about our beliefs and be willing to be introspective about them. If people stake more value on defending the belief they settled on first instead of continuing to search for truth, then disagreements will always devolve into shouting past each other and potentially escalate into violence. I also think we need more political change to make governments more representative of the people they govern and less likely to act on the whims of some power-hungry dictator.
God allows us to ground our morality in an objective manner instead of pure opinion of one person versus the next.
Yeah, except you can't force me to hold on to your beliefs, so it is just your opinion that there is a God which said whatever it is you believe it said. That means the morality you derive from God is still subjective, because you have subjectively chosen which God's moral codes you want to follow, and you interpret those codes according to your own biases. It may be scary to realize that morality is subjective, but pretending that it's not doesn't solve the issue. It just makes it worse because any two believers from different faiths can disagree on the morality they both think is set in stone, and it makes it difficult for them to honestly engage with each other.
You say the Bible isn't reliable, yet see over 2,000 prophecies confirmed from the Old Testament to the New Testament.
I don't see any fulfilled prophecies in the Bible, let alone 2,000 of them. I don't know of anything in the Bible which is specific enough to be a prophecy in the first place and historically verifiable that it happened. I'd give a more specific rebuttal, but Adam doesn't bother to share any examples, so this point is utterly unconvincing.
You say believers are living in a fairy tale, yet the evidence of Christianity is so overwhelming, I would ask you, how can you not believe?
I think I've explained pretty thoroughly why I find the supposed evidence to be thoroughly underwhelming. Fine-tuning arguments don't present a real probability and hence have no substance. Our existence as living creatures can be entirely accounted for by natural mechanisms. Supernatural claims need more than just testimony to back them up, and the prophecies Christians claim were either written after the prophesied events or too vague and poetic to be valid prophecies in the first place.
You say, why does God allow humans to suffer and not even have enough food to live?
I don't really ask that. The God of the Bible is clearly willing to cause human suffering, and I can even imagine how a triumni God would make us suffer for some higher purpose.
And I'll turn that question right around against humanity and ask, why do we as humans allow people to not get enough food and water to survive?
I wouldn't say that I or most people allow others to die so much as it isn't within our power to control. Most people are dealing with their own shit, and they can't lend a hand to someone around the world. Even those who can help out often struggle to find the motivation to travel so far and put so much effort into something. But more than anything, I think that we often just don't have good standards for picking our leaders. And so those with the power to do something about the poor and hungry let their greed get in the way and let them starve. People are tribalistic, and so the rich and powerful often forget about or ignore the poor and hungry. It isn't right, and it isn't particularly related to whether a God exists, but it does happen.
You say, why doesn't God just come down and show himself and so that we can believe? And I say to that, he already did, and we killed him. And I know that if he came again, we would try to kill him again because the world hates the truth and loves their sin.
First, don't put his death on me. I wasn't there. I didn't crucify him. And so what if we'd try to kill him again? He's God, so all of our attempts would fail unless he wants us to succeed. So why is it that Jesus' generation was given miracles to witness and believe in, while we only have faith in the Gospels to go on? I, for one, would find it much easier to accept Christ in my heart if I saw him come down, visit a hospital, and cure all the cripples. And if you stuck through to the end, thanks for watching this. Don't forget to
get right with God now.
And if you're an atheist who doesn't believe in God, you can take this as a euphemism to go read a fucking book.